Day 2 of the 2024 U.S. Senior and U.S. Junior Championships saw some dramatic results as several leaders have begun to emerge within the three fields. First up in the U.S. Senior Championships, top seed Grandmaster Vladimir Akopian won his second straight game, defeating former champion GM Alexander Shabalov to take the clear lead with 2 out of 2. Meanwhile, the defending champion GM Melik Khachiyan lost to tournament newcomer Julio Becerra, who bounced back from a loss yesterday. Also picking up his first win was Grandmaster Jesse Kraai, who defeated IM Douglas Root. In the U.S. Junior Championships, top seed Christopher Yu managed to win his second game as well, defeating Nicholas Ladan to hold on to a perfect score. Keeping pace was IM Justin Wang, who won his second straight game after surviving a lost position against IM Brewington Hardaway. Moving on to the U.S. Girls Junior, top seed Alice Lee was held to a draw by WFM Yasemin Asani. Meanwhile, the key matchup between FM Zoey Tang and WIM Iris Mu ended in a draw, leaving both players tied for first with 1.5 out of 2. Also leading are WFM Chloe Gaw, Jasmine Su, and FM Rose Atwell, who won her first game today against WIM Omya Vidyarthi. Meanwhile, Alice Lee is a full point behind on 0.5 out of 2 and will have to work to catch up in the remaining rounds. Jumping into the games, we'll start with the game between Alexander Shabalov and Vladimir Akopian. Here, Akopian, playing black, goes for the semi-Slav defense and gets a pretty reasonable position out of the opening. Now, this one gets very, very sharp as soon as white starts to play f3. Black responds with c5, and now g4. Very, very aggressive advance from Shabalov on the king side. But this ends up working out in black's favor after the very nice maneuver, knight e8 to d6. It turns out that white's kingside advances might have just created more weaknesses than actual attack. Here, after knight f4, c takes d4, white should have just recaptured e takes d4. The position would remain approximately balanced. But instead, Shabalov goes for knight takes d5. Turns out to be a blunder. Black plays bishop h4, getting the bishop off of the attack with tempo, rook to g2, and now very strong move from Akopian, g5. Simply winning a piece for black, as black is hitting the knight on f4, which is defending the knight on d5. So if that knight moves, then bishop takes d5 gives black a clear extra piece. Now g5 is very weakening, but there's simply nothing white can do to take advantage of this on the king side. Black has everything under control. e4 was played, and now knight to e5. Black could take the knight right away, but knight e5 is even stronger, gaining a tempo on the bishop. If this knight moves, then knight takes d3. Black continues to win material. Bishop b1 was played. Now black takes on f4, knight to g6. At this point, black is a piece up. White is trying for some compensation, but it's really not enough. Bishop to g5, a very nice move here. White takes the exchange on f8, but now simply queen takes f8. At this point, black has 2 pieces for the rook, but just a completely decisive advantage as black is soon going to be infiltrating on the dark squares. That's what we saw in the game after rook c7. Bishop takes d5, check on e3, knight comes into f4, black played rook to e8, and here white resigned as the position is very, very much hopeless. Black has ideas of bishop f2 followed by rook to e1. The d-pawn is very strong, and of course black is still materially ahead. So very nice win by Akopian, who keeps a perfect score, 2 out of 2, the only perfect score in the U.S. Senior. Now, playing spoiler today was Julio Becerra, who managed to defeat the reigning champion Melik Khachiyan. Melik, going into this day, had a perfect 1 out of 1, but ends up getting in trouble in today's game. Coming out of the opening, we had the Cobra Sicilian coming out of the 4 knights variation. And in this position, things ended up going wrong for black after one critical moment here. White advances h4, h5. Black pushes b4, knight a4. And here, Khachiyan needed to play the move h6, stopping white from making this advance and weakening black's dark squares. Instead, he plays the move queen to a5, hitting the knight on a4. But here, Becerra finds that he can play h6 anyway. The point is that if black takes the knight on a4, white takes on g7, knight takes g7, and then queen h4 is the point. Hitting the knight on e7, if black defends this one, well then queen takes h7, queen h8 check, knight to g8. Black is not getting mated, but But after rook h7, the knight on g7 is simply trapped. White is winning the piece back and is going to have a completely crushing attack from here. So after h6, black is forced to play g6, but this is definitely not what black wanted, as this h6 pawn becomes a huge asset for white for the rest of the game. Now b3, defending the knight on a4, d6, queen h4, nice move hitting the knight on e7, rook a7, king to b1, and now f4, continuing the attack. White is looking for ideas of f5 and open up the king side. Black played f6, and now very nice find by Becerra, queen e1, eyeing this diagonal with the threat of a3. Black here played e5, hitting the knight on d4, and simply a3 anyway, just a brilliant find. The point being, after e takes d4, a takes b4, black's queen on e5 surprisingly ends up trapped. The completely open fifth rank, but no safe squares to go to. Black is losing the queen and losing the game. So after a3, rook to b7 was played, giving the queen an escape square. Now takes, bishop c4 check, knight to e6, takes, knight c6, bishop to d5. At this point, white is just strategically dominating the position with fantastic pieces. And this h6 pawn, again, in the long term, a very, very big problem for black. Now Becerra takes on c6, rook to d5, takes on b4, picking up the first pawn, hitting the rook on f8. And white brings in the pieces here. White wins the second pawn. If not for a5, of course, there's just too much pressure against d6, as well as rook d7. The rook on f8 is hanging as well. So a5, Melik gives up another pawn to try and hold this, manages to take on e4, but now rook to d7. White's rook's invading on the 7th rank. Black does manage to get some counterplay with this e-pawn, but the pawn simply doesn't go very far. White's rook is very strong behind the pawn, and eventually the king comes in to help as well. Show you guys the finish here. After b5, f3, takes, b6. Black tries rook f2, just hoping to get some counterplay with the e-pawn, but it's simply not enough. White's rooks are way too strong, and of course the threat of b7 and rook a8 is very difficult to meet. So after rook f2, the game ended. After takes, king e2. Black resigned here, as he can take the pawn with check on c2, but there's just no follow-up. King to f1, and white is threatening mate on the back rank, as well as promoting the pawn. Black has no good follow-up with this pawn here and is just completely lost. So with that, Melik did resign this game, allowing Becerra to get back to an even score. Moving on to the U.S. Junior Championships, this is Christopher Yu's second game against Nicholas Ladan. Here, white plays the move knight to e4. It's a pretty equal position. We have a symmetrical English structure. After this move knight e4, it's actually black that gets the advantage. After the trade, doubling white's pawns, blocking the bishop on g2 as well. Rook fc8. Seems like black was already more comfortable here, taking over the c-file. The game saw queen d3, knight d4, trades in e3, but now bishop to e6, activating the bishop by heading towards the c4 square. Takes, queen f3, h5. Now the bishop comes this way around to g4, trades on d4. This position still tenable for white, but rather unpleasant as black's pieces are very active. The bishop on g2, not exactly a great bishop here. Rook to c3, rook c2. Christopher starts to put pressure against the f2 pawn. h3, bishop to e2. Nice move, just kind of freezing white. The bishop can reroute itself to d3 or c4. Here white goes h4, allowing the bishop back to g4, plays the move e5 to open up the bishop. But after queen to d4, white blunders with the move rook to a1, overlooking black's idea here of putting maximum pressure on f2, the move bishop to f5. Now the point is f2 is hit, and after rook f1, rook takes f2, white's position collapses in view of the tactic. After rook takes f2, black can take on a1 with check, then can take on e5 as well, and black will have at least two healthy extra pawns, maybe even a third after rook to c4. And yeah, white's position here is just hopeless. Instead of after queen d4, instead of rook a1, I think bishop e4 still kind of holding the balance for white, although definitely a difficult move to find. But it is a double attack on the rook, as well as possibly threatening bishop takes g6. So this would have been white's best chance by far to stay in the game. Instead, rook a1 was an unfortunate blunder. After bishop f5 and rook takes f2, Christopher managed to pick up his second win and stay on a perfect score. Also keeping perfect was I am Justin Wang, who's actually in very, very big trouble today against Brewington Hardaway. This is the position after Black's 25th move. D takes E5. White is just captured on E5, DE, and at this point, White sacrifices the knight on H6. White has just been building up for the sacrifice throughout the middle game and finally does it here. The knight sacrifice is quite strong. Even better was bishop takes H6 according to the engines. The idea that after takes, knight takes H6, White has all kinds of discovered attacks. If Black tries something like knight H7, then White has G4, for example. Knight F7 check is also good. But this idea to break through with G4, G5, and Rook F7 would basically leave Black in a completely losing position. The extra piece being this knight on A4, which is very, very far from the defense. After knight takes H6, if GH6 here, then Rook takes F6, for example, is very, very strong for White. And Black is likely just getting mated soon on the king side. So instead, Justin finds the only move to hang on, queen to E8, offering the endgame. White could take on E8 here. Black has to take with the D rook, otherwise knight F7 check wins the exchange. And here, White would keep healthy extra pawn. But of course, with queens off the board, it's not exactly what White was looking for with the sacrifice. Instead, the engine likes queen H4 or queen to G4 here, just keeping the tension. If the knight is taken, then Rook takes F6 then, of course, is still quite strong. But instead, Brewington goes wrong here with knight F7 check, king to G8, queen H8 check, forcing Black to take the piece on F7, and now bishop H6. And it looks quite brilliant. If Black takes the bishop, White has Rook takes F6 and is crashing through. For example, takes, king E7, queen G7, and Black has to give the queen is getting mated next move. But after bishop H6, White likely overlooked Black's key defensive resource here, king E7, just running with the king. And after queen takes G7 check, queen F7, Black is managing to survive with the extra knight. Apparently, bishop takes G7 here would keep rough equality for White according to the engines. But after knight to D7, of course, it's really quite an unclear position. Queen H7, queen F7, and yeah, game continues. But again, not the best that White could have gotten. So it takes queen F7, White drops back queen to G4, but now Black starts to consolidate and the king ends up very, very safe on E7. The knights come back around to the game and Black is eventually able to just overturn the position completely and set up some winning counterplay on the king side here. After queen to G6, the rook swing over to the H file, knight G4 check. And our rook takes H3, queen D6, and queen H7. Nicely calculated here by Justin. The point that after check, rook takes G4. Black is winning on the H file. Rook H1 takes on F1 with check. And after queen H3 check, White resigned. As Black is picking up the rook, next move, we'll have a clear rook up. And of course, just a completely winning position. So a bit of a lucky escape from Justin Wang, but he manages to stay on a perfect 2 out of 2 and keep the shared lead as well. Lastly, we've got the U.S. Girls Junior Championship, and here top seed Alice Lee was hoping to bounce back after her loss yesterday against WFM Yasemin Asani in this game, but it was not to be. White played a very, very solid London system, and the opening was rather equal for both sides. Trades on C6, knight to E5. Alice looking to create some kind of imbalance in the position in order to play for the win. Here, after knight C5, bishop C8, B3, White is doing everything right, challenging Black's space. Perhaps not queen D6, queen to D8 here would have been best. The point after B takes C4 is Black has this idea with B6, where White's knight is forced to go back, for example, knight to B3. And then after bishop A6, Black would be able to win back the pawn on C4 due to the pin on the diagonal. And this position certainly would be still quite complicated. However, we saw queen to D6, and difference is after takes, B6, knight B3, bishop A6, White gets this move C5 in with tempo. Otherwise, Black would be able to take the rook. And now after takes, DC, queen C7, White is doing absolutely fine here. In fact, it was White that missed a chance later on. Here after C6, E5, takes, queen to G3, tricky move, pinning the pawn to Black's queen. Here Alice needed to play the move queen F7. Instead she goes queen to C8, and here White missed a bit of a chance of the very, very strong move rook A B1. The point is that white is starting rook to b7 and then queen takes g7 mate. So if ed4, rook to b7, this is actually just lost for black. There's no good way of defending this one. If g6, for example, white has queen to h4, and once again, the queen and rook are going to be delivering mate to the king very, very soon. Instead, black would have to play bishop a6 here to cover the b7 square, but then knight c2, queen takes c6, and now knight to b4 would be quite nice for white. The point being that white can next take the bishop on a6, black will have to recapture after moving the queen, and then white will get rook takes d5 with a healthy extra pawn. That was a very, very nice resource, of course, pointed out by the engines. Instead, we saw knight to b3, and this allows black to eventually pick up this pawn and win the pawn back, equalizing the material. White does get knight c4, and after queen takes c4, we get this heavy piece position. It's actually very, very equal. Both sides have their weaknesses here, and really difficult for either side, but black here being the high-rated player to create some winning chances. The game saw trades of pawn c3, rook takes d5, rook d7, forcing black to trade off the second pair of rooks as well. And after takes, we get this queen and pawn endgame, of course, which is very, very drawish here. White having a nice active queen, safe king. And yeah, Alice tried to come in with the king, but Asani's defense here was quite sound. After e4, queen d5 check, the players do end up repeating here. Queen b7, king f6, and so on. At this point, there's no way for black to play on, and a draw was agreed. Next up, we've got the key matchup between Iris Mu and Zoey Tang. Iris, of course, the player that won the game against Alice Lee in the first round. Both of these players on 1 point going into today's game. They found themselves in this rook and knight endgame, which at first glance looks very, very equal. This one ended up being quite sharp here. After black's move rook to b7, white takes on g5, hg, and now goes knight f6 check, winning the pawn after rook takes f5. Now black gets king to g6. At this point, rook f2 would have been the safest option for white, preparing to meet rook f7 with knight to either e4 or g4. And we could get some knight endgame like this, where actually white keeps the extra pawn. Black has some activity, but it is an extra pawn for white with all the winning chances that come with it. Instead, we saw g4, where now after rook f7, things are actually not that easy. Knight to d5 was the idea. Rook takes f5, knight e7 check, knight takes f5. White keeps the extra pawn here, but with this pawn advanced to g4, it actually gives black more squares for the pieces. And here, actually, black is able to get some very, very quick activity. Knight c5, knight d3. So much so, after knight a4, is that it's actually black that ends up close to winning in this one. King f3, king to e5, knight g3 takes, knight e4. White does manage to win the g-pawn, but only at the cost of the c-pawn, and now black has their queenside counterplay as well. So knight f7 check, king d6, knight d8 check, king d7. Here, knight f7 was apparently the only way to keep the position a draw, the point being that if black plays b4, white can either take this one or start with knight e5 check first, and the c-pawn is hanging. Instead, after knight to b7, Zoey finds the only chance here. b4 takes, now a4. Very, very nice move, running the a-pawn down the board. If ab4, then knight a5, white will be able to pick up this pawn, stop the b-pawn, and hold the draw. After a4, black gets very close to winning here, because white is forced to play knight c5 check and actually take the pawn on a4. Otherwise, it's just very difficult for the knight to stop this pawn. This pawn is running. Here, black played king d6, and after takes, white ends up down a piece, but with several pawns. This endgame turns out to be a draw, as black does get this passed c-pawn, but the knight is tied down to its defense. Meanwhile, white's two passers on the king side occupy black's king. And what we essentially get here is a positional draw. Neither side can make progress, as both kings have to babysit the opposite side's passed pawns. And once again, neither side able to do anything here, as the players eventually repeat moves, and a draw is agreed. It turns out that black had a win. If we go back to this moment, instead of king to d6, king c6 apparently was winning here for black. The point that in the same endgame, after king to e4, for example, black has the additional resource of playing king to b5. So for example, c3, king to d3, king d5. White starts pushing the king side, and black is amazingly in time to take the pawn with the king on b4, defend the c-pawn, and most importantly, the knight is in time to get back. Knight c5 check, knight to e6, and white's pawns on the king side would be stopped. For example, h4, knight to g7. And the way this one plays out is, well, white simply can't advance the pawns without losing them. After king to c1, for example, king to b3, let's say king to b1, c2 check, king to c1. Black can now play the move king to c3. It's a very, very instructive way to win the game. After h5, knight takes h5, g7. If black were to take this one, we'd have a draw by stalemate, but the knight is just in time to deliver a mate with knight f4 and knight to d3. So very, very nice resource. Of course, very difficult to see this from afar, especially the entire line. Black had to find this idea of playing king to b5, king to b4, and then see that the knight can stop the kingside pawns. Not easy to do, but a very, very instructive win pointed out by the engines. Instead, of course, we saw king d6, and as I mentioned, this game was eventually drawn. So that brings us into tomorrow's round 3, where we've got several leaders that will be looking to extend their lead as they fight for the national title. Should be a very, very exciting day of chess ahead of us tomorrow. Hopefully, I'll see you folks back here for the recap. Until then, take care.